Hey everyone, welcome to the first episode of the You and AI podcast, a show brought to you by you.com, a productivity engine. My name is Julia La Roche. I am the head of PR and communications. And joining me today as my first guest and hopefully co-host on this show is Bryan McCann, our co-founder and CTO. Bryan, thank you so much for doing this. I finally convinced someone to do the first episode. I really appreciate you taking the time.
I really appreciate you pushing us to do it. I think it's a great effort.
I'm excited for folks to also get to learn about not just you.com, but to get to learn about you and your journey in AI. And one of the things about you, Bryan, is I kind of describe you in a way as an accidental computer scientist because that was never the intention. You were studying philosophy. Can you just take us back to the beginning and how you got into computer science and how it also blends with your interest in philosophy?
Yeah. You're right. Yeah, I started in philosophy, the good old foundations there. I was really interested in meaning, broadly speaking. I was really interested in how humans do it, like what it is as an experience, how it's generated. You can have experiences that feel meaningful to some extent, and you can have experiences that maybe don't feel meaningful. It's a very meaningful experience. That's our first podcast episode for you.com. And then there's maybe meaning that we associate with language. Like, what does a word mean? Or what do they mean when they're saying that? So there's lots of different meanings for meaning, but I was interested in all of them. The academic world, at least the philosophy department at Stanford, and kind of what's called the analytic philosophy, or there's all these different kind of branches. A lot of that tries to reduce questions of meaning to a scope that only includes language, because it's something that we can observe a little bit, at least, and study. So if you narrow in from meaning to language, you can start talking about semantics and studying, linguistics and philosophizing about how all of this stuff really works behind the scenes. But to be honest with you, around my third year there, I felt like I was hitting a dead end on the armchair philosophy approach to language. And I felt like I was not quite getting the study of meaning I was looking for. So I'd been doing computer science on the side, to your point, mostly for fun, because you can't really, well, maybe you can, but it was very common to have to take at least one computer science class or something. Just culturally at Stanford, that was a thing a lot of people tried. So actually, my best friend at the time, my roommate, we took our first computer science.
That was Nat.
It was Nat. We took our first computer science class together, and I really liked it. So I just kept doing it. And fortunately, the two converged around that time where I was like, well, maybe instead of doing armchair philosophy, we could use computational tools to study language. And so I went to the computer science department and I tried to find people that were working on something related to language. And I found Richard Socher, our CEO and my co-founder. So this was back in 2013. And he was well into, essentially making deep learning for natural language processing. And I saw a lot of overlap between what was going on there and what I believed or had some intuition about language from the philosophical perspective. It just made a lot of sense from like a Wittgensteinian philosophical approach to language. And there's someone named Firth, and there's all these kind of hypotheses that we had on the armchair philosophy side that were in some sense being really tested in a computational way through deep learning and through some of the AI work. So I basically fell in love with it right away and started working with Richard on some of that stuff. And yeah, that's how it happened.
So Richard Socher is our co-founder and CEO, and he was really a pioneer for bringing natural language into deep learning, or deep learning into natural language.
Yeah, applying deep learning
into natural language processing. One of the things I've heard Richard talk about, at least talking about you especially, so y'all met in 2013 have basically been collaborating on research the last decade as well, is he said that you're someone who likes to work on hard problems, especially problems that are considered solved, which I really like. Where does that come from? And why are you so driven? Like, so many people will say, no, I don't want to work on that. Where does that come from?
That's a great question too. Where does that come from? I think there are two things that, especially around that time and throughout my research career, I was really motivated by. I used to start, I was trying to just have as much impact as possible. But that's a kind of vague statement. And eventually I came across the statement more that I really like to work on impossible problems. Things that a lot of people, based on the current ways of thinking, at least, thought of them as impossible problems, or impossible to solve in some sense. Why? Well, I think it requires a lot of creative thinking, maybe. Like if there's a lot of people who think a problem is impossible, and you have some gut feeling that it's not, and maybe you even have some intuition about how it could be done differently, well, you're in a really good place to then have a lot of impact. So when I was starting out in research, for example, I had this gut feeling that things should be done differently, that we should have unified models for natural language and other modalities. Altogether, actually, was my first initial work, which to some extent got me hired into research by Richard eventually. But when I would give talks on this idea, that we should have large models that are unified, that combined all these different data sources, well, maybe 50% of the people would respond to that well and say, this is, that's the kind of AI we've been trying to make, or that we kind of got into the field to make, but have forgotten about that to some extent. And the other 50% would say something like, well, this is a terrible idea because it's bad software engineering principles. It doesn't decompose the hard problems into small problems. How are we going to launch these large models? How are we going to observe all these like relationships between data and AI? And but that was my intuition for how we could solve some like very, very hard problems, we would say now, but they were considered like almost impossible problems of the day. So yeah, I think it requires creative thinking. It requires like getting out of the current methods and paradigms and trying to create paradigm shifts, which I think is just a fun, I don't know. It's just
how about like, fun. Does it require like resiliency to like just keep going even when you have like naysayers?
It definitely does. I don't know if that's why I like it, but it definitely does require resiliency. Honestly, not so much even because of the naysayers, but because you're often you're working alone. It's really like I'm managing people. I work with teams. I love building teams. There's a part of me that always liked that. But if you're working on something that a lot of people think is impossible, or they don't think it's worth working on, or they just think it's really hard or something like that, but you're not working with a lot of people. Maybe they're around you. You might be around people. I had a great team around me, and we exchange ideas all the time. But no one really is pushing that boulder up the hill with you. And so actually, I'd say the day-to-day resiliency that you just have to have with yourself, your own mind, questioning, is it impossible? Am I wrong? Like, is this intuition bad? And then maybe weeks go by where you get no positive signal that you're right, because you're working with computers, and computers are right. When you give them code and it says you're wrong, you're wrong, typically, at least in code. And so I'd say maybe that part requires the most resilience. By the time you get in front of people and you're telling them, you're like, I'm my own worst critic,
Well, speaking of like hard problem or something that many people considered solved. So you and Richard, late summer of 2020, set out to rethink. And this is what I thought was interesting. It wasn't just like rethinking search, you were talking about rethinking the search box.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite realize that or understand that. Can you take me back to that time? And what were you guys like rethinking as it relates to the search box or search even more broadly?
Yeah, that was a really interesting time, especially in hindsight, I think, because you're right. At the time, people thought of search as a solved problem. Google had done it. Google was this dominant player that had captured the entire market, essentially. And there was no way to really beat them because the flywheel between them, having so much distribution, having blocked off so many different channels for kind of attacking the moats they had, and then collecting so much data on people to make their algorithms better. Like how do you beat that? Well, we were looking at the search box as just the place to start a journey. And we were looking at the search results page, which was mostly unchanged for a decade or 2 decades, 20 years. Yeah. Blue links, mostly operating as a terminal to take you somewhere else.
A lot of ads.
A lot of ads. Yeah. So when we saw language models coming to fruition and the inflection point coming in AI, the idea was, if these models to some extent understand us better, and the philosopher in me goes like, what do we mean by understanding? Because it's very hard you can't pin down any like meaning in these models. That was like one of the first things I learned early on. But they kind of understand us in some way. So if we just grant that, then there should be an opportunity to do search differently and understand what users want way better than before, rather than relying so much on tracking them all around the web so you know what they want. Maybe we could just understand when they ask. And so we started designing the search stack, which now has just evolved into an AI stack. A lot of people would not even think about it as just a search stack either. Compound AI systems or AI assistants, whatever you want to call it. There's been this new paradigm that's been evolving that is well beyond search, and search is just a part of it. And it's about actually getting people what they need, helping them do what they want to do, be more productive, be more creative, be more inspired. So I think that's what we were picking up. And then when we went out and nobody understood why you would start a search engine, I think it was because of these preconceptions about what search was. Search is, for a lot of people, synonymous with Google. And, it's not really any different from your browser. They're all tied together. But now those concepts are unbundling a little bit, and they've allowed us to rebundle as like a different kind of thing, whether it's ChatGPT or agents. It's going to keep reshuffling until we find the next kind of steady state where people are augmented by this AI system in a way that's much, much better than before.
Yeah. I remember it must have been even as early as like September 2021 when we were still in a private beta. Mm-hmm. You all were deploying large language models. That was the first time I ever heard about a large language model. Y'all were deploying LLMs within a search results context using natural language before ChatGPT even existed. I remember there was a writing tool soon after that, AI art. And it was this notion at the time of like a do engine. And I think that ties to productivity. Can you explain that, that initial concept, but how we've evolved now to more of a productivity engine?
Yeah. The flow for us went, Richard and I always had this vision of being more of a do engine, right? Which was, I think, very closely tied to this idea of AI assistance today, and trying to realize and actualize the vision, the promises of the Siris, Alexas, Cortanas, like all those before, plus a lot of other things, right? So instead of getting links, you should either get something to do, something to allow you to move forward in whatever you're trying to achieve, or you should just have it done for you. We spent a long time trying to get to one-click buy buttons and one-click done buttons, for different flows of either workflows or really back then for us, because we were mostly focused on consumer types of things. We started launching these applications within u.com so that if you searched for something like how to write well or, writer's block, we would bring up a little app that was called U-Write, and it was using large language models, and it would help you write whatever you needed to. Or we would bring up an application for Imagine to generate images. If you search for AI art, why settle for just links to maybe news sources about AI art or blog posts about AI? Why not participate? Why not be able to do instead of just search? So we were really trying to push those ideas. And interestingly, the users were very split by this, because when you're working, especially in a consumer application, you're always trying to kind of change things, but then there's all of these expectations. So if you kind of look like a search engine, and you're working with a search box, people get a lot of expectations about what their experience should be like. And you're kind of 50-50 split on when someone sees that new thing, which is like, oh, I'm going to do something with this. I'm going to interact with this. Well, half the people say, wow, that's awesome. This is cool. And half the people are like, this is weird. What is this? I don't understand. So the last few years, the transition for u.com in many ways has been bringing users along and like changing user behavior gradually, sometimes not so gradually. I think ChatGPT was like a sharp break, and then people started thinking about chat versus search, and that was very helpful for us as well, because it helped communicate that to users. And now we're very much squarely in that productivity space, where we're trying to be a productivity engine, where it's sure you might start with a box that looks like what we would have called a search box before. Maybe some people call it a chat window now. But really the whole idea is that you should be able to say or type anything into that thing. And we should be able to help you get that done.
Yeah. You can tell it what to do.
You should be able to tell what to do, tell what to generate, tell what you need. And it should be able to get you further along than anything else could.
Something I've noticed, I host another podcast besides this one.
Cool.
So I love interviewing people and talking to people. I've noticed like using these AI tools, like using u.com, it's helped me learn how to ask better questions.
Yeah.
Or open up the possibilities of the questions I could ask.
Yeah. I think that's like a really beautiful part about some of the AI for creativity. That's a flavor of that is what got me obsessed with language models once they started working. In the early days, we wouldn't even have called them large by today's standards. They were just language models, but you could get them to generate some stuff. And we trained some pretty large open source ones before u.com. And even if it couldn't, complete a productivity workflow for you at the time, you could kind of talk to it. And it was really fun to see it say things that maybe you wouldn't expect, or if you're asking it for advice on something, whatever it is, or if you're asking questions, it would obviously say something different than what you might have said. And that's just enough to kind of, at least for me, it was just enough to get my brain thinking really differently about things. Sometimes you can get really kind of stuck in how you think about things, and you need some noise added in there, or some nudges just to not be quite like that. And then your brain can open up and you can get way more creative. Yeah. So I enjoyed the inspirational augmentation, I guess.
Yeah, I do too. Let me ask you this. We've seen the potential of LLMs when they came on the scene, like in a major way. Like everyone's probably used it at some point. Do you think, have we like passed like where it was like a proof of concept, and do you think we're moving into like where it's going to start to become like table stakes? I'm talking specifically like at work, for example, and companies and businesses. deploying it. Do you have a perspective there?
Yeah, I think it's still early days. I do think that there's value there. I think like there's been plenty of cases showing that a lot of value can be achieved, and you can automate a lot of workflows. You can make people more effective with their work. I think there are plenty of studies out there, research papers from universities, and the evidence is definitely there. But I do think sometimes what I've seen is that it still requires some creativity to get there.
Mm-hmm.
There are obvious cases where the models are good enough. And then there are some less obvious cases where we still have to prove it out. I think there will be ROI. I think it's just important for people to be really conscious about how they're going to go about it. I think if you have a clear need and AIs, like these large language models, are a perfect fit for it, great. You're actually probably one of the few. That could be many still, but relative to the rest of the world, there's a lot more people that are saying, I want to use this somehow, or I'm curious about it, but I don't really know how. Like a lot of CIOs, CTOs, and companies might have almost like a mandate in some sense at this point to AI, like bring AI into their company, but it's not totally clear all the time how that will go.
Why do you think it's so difficult to deploy or bring it in? Is it like what's kind of holding it back or holding the space back?
Yeah, this is something that we've focused a lot on at U.com. There's still, for some of these workflows and some of these use cases, there's a huge gap between a language model out of the box, as impressive as they are, and actually running it, not just in production, but running it in production and having it essentially be good enough and trustworthy enough and accurate enough. I think if you're going to ChatGPT and a language model hallucinates, maybe there are some negative consequences of that if you make worse decisions based on it. But if you're doing that for work, well, then maybe the consequences are even steeper. And if you're automatically running workflows and then other algorithms are running off of that, and these errors get compounded and propagate out into and like amplified, well, then at some point the inaccuracies become the biggest problem to actually deploying it further at scale, which is why at U.com, we, I think, focus a lot on the undervalued part of orchestrating these LLMs. We've got like a suite of, I don't know, a dozen models that run in conjunction with an actual LLM. So the LLM might generate a final response for you, but we've got citation models, intent-based models, trying to understand, rewriting models, query expansion models, a lot of stuff around those LLMs. That's kind of like an operating system for this new paradigm that actually makes it work. And then making that not just for one language model, but making it a model agnostic platform like U.com is yet another challenge, because you don't really want to have to do that for every single LLM that comes out, right? So you have to develop like kind of more general processes that takes in an LLM and outputs a more trustworthy one. And that's been really fun to work on.
That is really cool. I actually I had not heard it described as like an operating system. So I'm going to get you to elaborate a bit more on that. But it's interesting you brought up accuracy, because I was reading a report, it was from McKinsey recently, and that is the number one risk for businesses. Like they're all ramping up, at least having people within their companies use it, small groups even like use AI, but organizations cannot tolerate inaccurate outputs. Okay, you mentioned like this operating system around bringing more trust, like building more trustworthy LLM experiences, model agnostic. Like, okay, take me a little bit, like share a little bit more about that and how that works and why are we able to solve this huge problem?
Yeah. So to elaborate on the operating system metaphor, which I think Andre Karpathy, had a really good introduction of this metaphor into the field around using language models as a different kind of CPU or computational, device that will add other things to and around. But in every instance, especially for U.com, it evolves a little bit differently. But the main idea is that in an operating system, like for a computer, you have all these different abstractions that we're using to actually do the computing for you. There's the memory, right? Where things are stored. There's the CPU that actually kind of does the computing itself. There's even things like, it's managing security for you, or, making sure your browser can come up and then, you can switch over to a different application, like managing the workflows, right? So all of these analogies can be ported over to some extent and say, okay, well, if a language model is the thing that's doing the reasoning for us to some extent, well, we can bolt on some memory, right? And then we need to be able to search through that memory. So things like retrieval augmented generation will retrieve things from memory to augment the generation. And that's allowing us to, for example, in our case, cite a lot of sources, right? We can almost say like, oh, this is where this information is coming from. There's tools, which we talked about before, right? If I give access to a lot of APIs and tools, those can be included. I think of it as having for us like 4 really high level pillars. We have an understanding pillar, which is taking a query, it's understanding what a user means, maybe rewriting things for them to interact with those APIs and search engines, tracking context, maybe personalizing answers and personalizing even like recording personalized information from the user if they have that enabled. There's the LLM piece, which can be open source LLMs, fine-tuned LLMs, foundation model APIs. And then there's search and retrieval, which is kind of like the memory part, which can be public data, proprietary data, individual data. And then there's the agentic tool use, whether that's company-specific tools or publicly accessible tools and APIs. Maybe you can log in as a person and do things on their behalf. When you put those all together, there's lots of individual components within each, but you get a pretty holistic operating system for, I think, what we would want to do moving forward.
You mentioned agentic workflows. I feel like I'm hearing this term all the time for the layperson. Can you fill us in on agentic workflows? Where do you see that headed? Even autopilots. Why is this so exciting and interesting?
Yeah, it's essentially what I'm most excited about right now. In a lot of ways, the agentic workflows for me are synonymous with tool use. So general tool use, like that would be an amazing goal for us to actually achieve. And there's some signals that this is achievable, but sometimes they're unreliable. And I'll maybe provide an anecdote to describe what's going on there too. But yeah, in general, it's tool use. And what does this mean? It means, well, instead of just taking a bunch of information, maybe retrieving that from some memory store or a search index of some kind, and augmenting generation and essentially summarizing it or synthesizing some answer out of it, we're saying, well, that's kind of one tool. You could go out to memory, or you could go out to this other API, or you could go out to another one, or you could call out to something to generate images. You could call out to book flights. You could book reservations. These are very standard ones that come up for assistance. But there are a lot of tools inside companies, like databases that something like this could access, apps that it could access on your behalf, messages it could be writing for you, tickets it could be filling out, all these things it could be doing programmatically and automatically. And instead of you going to an interface and saying, rewrite this thing for me, and then you copy and paste that over into Notion or Google Drive or whatever else, what if it just accessed that for you and just did it and it wrote it there? What if you woke up in the morning and it had done a bunch of work for you, and you could just edit it and say confirm, deny, that would be a completely different way of working with AI if it was almost proactive rather than just responding to you. I'm really excited about those and the potential for these autopilots instead of just co-pilots, which people are using to, work alongside them. Let's just automate some workflows. Some workflows could just be continuously running all the time, and you're just like turn your workflow into a feed where you just edit it, right? Instead of you being the one that's doing it and then having a co-pilot. I think that's where I'd like to see the agentic paradigm go.
You think? And you think that's okay? It sounds like obviously you're excited about it.
Yeah.
Is that where the space is headed? And yeah, just from someone who's been in this space for a decade, doing research and building companies, talk to me like what could that mean? And maybe we can be a bit more forward-looking, future-looking. Like, talk to me about like the implications there.
Yeah, it's where I'd like to see things go. I think the technology could go there. I think it could do it. It's not there all the way for some things. And here's where I'll sneak in the anecdote from before. When we were working on language models before they were large and they were just a toy and it was sometimes hard to even publish on them, they would, or even today, if you start out training a language model from scratch, you'll see that if you generate from them, they'll often just like repeat a lot of words. And then as they got bigger and a little bit better, maybe they would get nice coherent sentences, but then they would start repeating those sentences or repeating those phrases. And then they got better to the point where we had like GPT-2 and, the CTRL control model that we'd made at Salesforce when we were doing research. And these models would maybe start repeating paragraphs. You could get a paragraph out of it, but it would repeat that. And then it would get stuck. It would be a really odd thing you'd see. So the corollary is that happens now in these agentic workflows, but it's not words or sentences or paragraphs. It's these steps of reasoning. So if we often talk about it as like chain of thought. So we like generate a thought, and then we're using a language model, and then the thought gets translated into some action, like call out to this API or do this thing. Well, you'll see the responses kind of like start to break down. Instead of just words, now it's like you get a sequence of thoughts, and then the compounding errors or whatever is really going on there. I've never had a really satisfying explanation. Eventually, you get these errors that are too great. Now we're mitigating that. And I've seen some really, really promising demos from like our hackathons and things like that at U.com, where I think the technology can go much, much further than it. Like it is kind of ready. The other main obstacle is that the world might not want to open up the highways between all these different APIs and data sources as easily as we'd like if you were just taking the perspective that you wanted to advance the technology as fast as possible. There's a big trend towards actually closing off data sources. And, because data is so important and valuable for different companies, maybe they don't want these agents interacting with their APIs and doing things on your behalf, because then they lose you. They're kind of disintermediated. And so can the technology do it? I think we're going to get there actually faster than probably culturally or something like that. We'll be okay letting these agents run move on the highway fast enough. We'll probably have lots of roadblocks, I think.
You mentioned the hackathons that we do. And I have to say, like, I love our engineering team. They're the absolute best. And I think a lot of that has to do with the culture that you've built as CTO and co-founder. I think you get asked this a lot by candidates. What is it like being a CTO? You've been doing this for 4 years now. So take me inside that. Like, what is it like? How do you build a culture of, creativity, experimentation?
Yeah, it's a really common question I get from especially people who I've worked with, in AI. They're practitioners or researchers, scientists, but they haven't quite made the jump to perhaps like making their own startup. And it's been really different the whole time. I would say the first thing I usually tell people is that the CTO role, especially if it's combined with a founding role, means that your job's going to change essentially constantly. From the first day, you're writing the first lines of code. Potentially I was, at least. But sometimes CTOs don't do that, right? So in a lot of ways, you're doing whatever it takes, from writing the first lines of code to hiring the first engineers to creating processes so those people can hire people. You go from being maybe a tech lead type for a while, if you only have 4 or 5 engineers, and you're trying to find product market fit, doing a lot of quick experimentation, to maybe quickly going to like a large scale type management position where you're managing dozens of individuals. And depending on where the organization needs to go, you are essentially in a position to change your role to fit that need, which I think is really interesting. So I think before doing this job, the CTO role at U.com, I kind of had my job, right? I was doing AI research. I was making language models. I was pushing for unified approaches to AI. And even as I took on a team and was managing people, that was still my main thing. But as a CTO, you're deciding what your main thing is in conjunction with the needs of the organization. But if you're founding a startup and you're in the early years, that can change very, very rapidly and all the time. And that means not only you change, but then you have to build an organization and a team that can change and can learn and be really flexible. So I'm super happy that I often hear we have a culture of excellence, but also a culture of kindness in the engineering team. I think that's really important when we're doing such hard things, to also be able to essentially sometimes at least make it feel a little bit like play. So there's room for error, because then there's room for learning. And, I train neural networks. So I just think of the organization like a neural network. You have to have these feedback loops. And I think if you could build an organization to learn the way a neural network does, that's in some ways an ideal paradigm.
I like that metaphor, the neural network. Okay, so this is more of a curiosity. As a CTO, an engineer as well, an accidental computer scientist, as I put it before.
Yeah.
I am curious, like AI, and how do you think it's going to change, how developers work? What do you think are some of the impacts? How do you see that space evolving and changing? I think you'd have an interesting perspective as a CTO.
Yeah.
And coming from a philosophy background even.
Yeah, lots of thoughts
on
the future of work. I think with developers are interesting, because I see some folks, pick up something like Copilot and they're coding with it all the time. They love it. I think it is good for some of the workflows that developers have. But then I have a lot of engineers that say it's not helping them at all. Perhaps because they're closer to things that have never been done before. And that's where AI is, in some sense, less useful, right? Because it's trained on essentially all of this code, all these things that we've done before. If you need to do something that's been done before, it can probably help you do it. But if you're really trying to make something new, then it's less helpful. Maybe it can save you some time with some boilerplate stuff, but it's not really doing the actual job of like a really creative, product-minded, kind of holistically oriented engineer, which is the type of engineer I love to hire, right? Not one that's just taking tickets and doing things, but like is creating new knowledge from the experience of doing the work. Like we're all learning together at the forefront and at the frontier of these things. So the things often that they learn, no one has learned before. All of my AI engineers are in some sense doing research, and the backend engineers, the front-end engineers are in some sense doing research with those people to create an experience that melds these technologies together. But in a lot of ways, having that space and a room to be creative is really important. I don't think that's going to go away. AI can help, but it's not going to go away. And I think the important thing is for them, as well with anyone, to start thinking more and more where these AI tools can automate, where they can be autopilots. I hope we get there for a lot of workflows instead of just co-pilots. So you can focus on the things that are more this creative, holistic, kind of strategic, however you want to think about it, whatever is more fulfilling for you.
I like that. That was so interesting when you just said, like, it's almost like they are doing research in tandem with building product at the same time. As someone who comes from a research background, like, do you have a perspective on like AI research now, like what that space is like, or are more people just kind of just doing it in tandem as they're building products?
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, I guess the true blue sky research, like academic research, there's a lot of things very interesting still coming out of there. Challenges to transformers as the dominant model that people are using are one example of something that's fun to see, because, you know, back when I started, we wanted to get rid of things like LSTMs, long short-term memory. That was the dominant model for language at the time. Then we found transformers, and everybody switched to transformers, but there were still some nice properties of LSTMs and recurrent neural networks. And so academic research, I feel like it's to continually explore these different branches and weave them together. I think that's where it's like most helpful on maybe longer time horizons than companies sometimes can. It's not always true, right? That's generalization maybe. Like a lot of companies create organizations that can do that kind of research. But for us, I'd say it's a different kind of research, because you're trying to iterate so quickly with people, typically too, like end users. And that can be really, really helpful for learning certain kinds of things. But it also means you're going to make different trade-offs and maybe not explore certain questions that academic research is best suited for.
Yeah. Well, you know, I used U.com for some of the questions I'm asking you today, which nice. I feel like every podcast host should do it. Let me ask you the final question here. And that is, how do you see AI and human collaboration evolving?
Yeah, I think it's, this is, going back to my original roots of caring about meaning. I'm still hopeful that as we go through this entire process, which may involve developers changing their workflows and marketing people and salespeople, maybe some jobs are going to go away, new jobs will come out, and we'll have to figure out what those look like. I'm hoping that at the end of it all, after a lot of people probably redefine themselves, to redefine their relationship to work, maybe what their role is, the way that my role has changed a lot. I hope that at the end, we somehow have gone through a process of meaning creation and generation that allows us to say it was all, it's all worth it on that level, and not just, I don't know, the economic numbers, and, I hope we navigate the policy and the politics of it all as smoothly as possible. But I really do hope that on the AI human collaboration level, it feels like collaboration, and we all come out of it feeling like life is a little bit more fulfilling. There's a little bit more time for meaning. And if AI can do that, then that's, I don't know, I'll in some way consider the ultimate goal achieved from when I started out.
Bryan McCann, co-founder and CTO of U.com. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time, all of your knowledge, your wisdom. I appreciate you doing this and coming on for the first episode. Thanks again.
Thank you.